So this project is about ventures into photogrammetry and 3D printing. In this video, I'm going to be detailing some of the more technical processes that I went through when capturing artifacts in 3D. So my name is Trevor Collinari. This project was done over the course of a fall semester at UCF in 2020. And I've done this under Florida Public Archaeology Network's East Central Office under the direction of Emma Dietrich, the public archaeologist for the region. So as far as a quick introduction, my name is Trevor Collinari. I'm a graduate student working towards an MA in public history. I'm a teacher for Orange County Public Schools. So I teach 6th grade world history and 7th grade civics. And I want my thesis to use some of the methodologies that I'm going to be using here. So the creation of a digital exhibit and a physical exhibit that uses 3D models and prints to tell a story. So as I've said, this was done with FPAN. The project itself, the goal for this project is to capture and create 3D models based off of 6 artifacts from the Sanford Museum, and to print those artifacts on a stereolithography or SLA resin printer and an FDM filament printer in order to compare replication processes. Now, the FDM printer is FPAN's printer, so I didn't work with that printer, but however, the SLA printer, resin printer, I do own one personally, and that will be what I'll talk about later in the video is my process working with that. And this project was all self-paced, so over the course of the fall semester, so from August till December 1st, I was able to accomplish what you see here with having no prior experience with photogrammetry. So this was all done self-paced, independently taught. So without further ado, let me show you how I went about this. Alrighty, so I'm going to go ahead and walk you through the process that I went through, both to render one of these models with photogrammetry and prepare that for the 3D printer that I'm using, which is going to be the Anycubic Photon. So just a few quick notes about what I am using. I'm using the program I'm using is around $180. It's Metashape, and I was thankful enough that FPAN provided this for me for this project. I do highly recommend Metashape. There is free open source software that you can use, and they do have certain limitations. I just really like Metashape, and so for the process that I'm going to show you, it's going to be tailored to this. But what we're first going to go ahead and do is you're going to have to import the photos that you took. So if we go ahead over here and we hit this button, add photos, you just have to go ahead and find the photos on your computer. I already organized them all by artifact. So this is the glued arrow head that we're working with. And I already organized them by chunk. And I'll show you what I mean in a little bit. But we're just going to go down here and shift click to bring all these photos into our workspace. And so it says that we are working in chunk 1, which again comes into play later, but we have 137 cameras. And cameras are really going to be pictures, right, that are taken in a different space. And so all the pictures do load in here if you wanted to monitor and see them. But what we're going to go ahead and do to start off with is we are going to align these photos. So you're going to go to Workflow, Align Photos, right? These are the settings that I'm using, and I do use high. And this will take a few minutes to align, and then we'll see what it looks like. Alrighty, so it took about a minute or so for this process to finish. And I mean, sometimes you get this warning that some photos fail to align, and they were just generally photos that were not either were a little too blurry or maybe taken at a different point in time. And so what Metashape will go ahead and do is ignore those photos for the purposes of what we have. So what we're looking at right here is called the sparse point cloud. And so just a few quick notes before we move forward about how I got all of this is that if we hit this button right here, show cameras, this will show the 137 cameras that we were working with. And then if you were to click on these individual cameras, it would show you what photo that's coming from. And so what I ended up doing in order to capture this is I moved around the object, as you can see, taking photos where you see each of these little blue squares. And I went all the way around the photo. And then just like what Metashape's guide recommends is that you want to create a dome, so to speak. So you want to come above the photo now, and you want to take photos in that ring. And if you really wanted to, you can even go up onto a higher ring, which is what I did for some of the more difficult artifacts, and captured that higher third level. Some people will recommend that you need about 50 photos or 50 cameras to really make a model. My opinion was or is to go big or go home, right? I often found that if I took like 60 or 70 photos or cameras for a single chunk, that I always end up missing some data later on, which can just cause the whole thing to be worthless, and you have to go back and start again, or go back and take more photos in order to fill in those areas of data. And you'll see a little bit about what I mean there. And so you can see down here in the photos really is that, so I started out taking that's the photo planted in Play-Doh. So that way I can be able to capture both sides of this arrowhead. And then I just, slowly went around the model all the way, right? So going back over here to the model, right, we'll go ahead and see that's the photo I selected, and it's highlighting that square for me right now. But this is going to get really cluttered, so we're just going to turn the cameras off. But anyways, that describes how I took the photos. And Metashape knows what camera you took this on, as well as a lot of the camera details, because that information is just stored in the photo. So I took all of these photos on the Samsung Galaxy Note 10 Plus, which is my personal phone. And that's really what the whole part of this project is advocating for. I didn't do this with fancy lighting setups or fancy cameras. So just low-cost photogrammetry, just the phone that I have in my pocket, minus the cost of the phone and the cost of the program. But this is the sparse point cloud that we're dealing with. And so you can see all these points that are captured really far out here. Now what you can do is you can select this tool. We're going to do freeform selection. And you could select these one by one and hit delete, right? Like this, right? Or this. But what I found to be much easier, and it took me a while to figure this out, is that we're just going to select the model itself. And then we're going to hit this instead. We're going to hit crop selection, which basically inverts our selection and deletes all of that. And we're actually going to go ahead and do that again because there are some points farther out there. So we'll just hit crop or freeform selection, and we'll hit crop selection. Right. So this is the sparse points cloud that we are dealing with. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is we're going to take this another step further. We're going to go further. We're going to go to workflow. We're going to build the dense point cloud now. Right. So we're going to take this that step farther. So what we're going to go ahead and do is you can run this on higher or lower settings, which will impact the overall outcome of what this ends up looking like. I have run things on high before, but it really is going to depend on the quality of your computer on how fast this runs. I ended up going with medium. It takes about an hour for me to render a model like this with this many cameras on high. But for the sake of time, I'll do medium. Something that's very important that by default this is not checked. You're going to want to calculate point colors and calculate point confidence. So do make sure that that is checked for later on, and then you just hit OK, and we'll come back after this process finishes. And we're back over here. It took about a little less than 5 minutes to get this processed on my computer on medium. But what we're going to go ahead and do, we're still looking at the sparse point cloud. So we're going to go ahead and move our cursor over here and click this to view the dense point cloud. And so there's a lot of noise that's going on over here. But so far, the model does look pretty good. So what we're going to go ahead and do now is we need to clean up all this noise. And what I initially did was go through each and every one of these things and delete them, or try to follow that and reverse the selection. But instead, we're going to do this a different way. We're going to click this drop down and we're going to go to dense cloud confidence, which is going to give us this heat map looking thing, where it essentially is going to organize every single one of these points based off of the confidence that Metashape has in their location. And so these darker blue colors and teal colors are pretty confident, but the red colors and orange and yellows, which you can see is all the noise, is not that confident, right? So what we're going to go ahead and do is we want to just delete all the red and yellows and oranges. So how we do that is we're going to go to Tools, and this was important to enable that confidence feature earlier on when building the dense point cloud. So we're going to go to Tools, we'll go to Dense Cloud, and this saved so much time once when I figured this out. But you're going to go to Filter by Confidence, right? So it gives you a range of 0 to 225. We're going to do this from 0 to 4. And that's going to filter out all the points that are above 4 on this scale. And so you can see that these are all the problem points, all the non-confident noise that we want to delete. So now that we have that selected, we can go ahead and hit this freeform selection tool, and we're good to just delete all those. So now we're going to have to bring it back. So we're going to go to Tools, Dense Cloud, and then we'll go to Filter by Confidence. And we'll go back to 0 to 225, and this is the result that we are looking at. And so as you can see, that it has a lot less noise. And so what we're going to go ahead and do now, we don't need this anymore, so we can just go to Dense Cloud. Maybe grab this stray point, maybe that stray point. And because this is this artifact, is pretty thin, and we want to capture every aspect of it, we stand it up in Play-Doh. Right, and so what we're going to do now is we don't need that Play-Doh. And so we're just going to take our freeform selection tool, and we're just going to cut that right across, grab all that, and hit delete, because we don't need the Play-Doh part of this model. And so this does leave us behind with this. Now we're going to go back to workflow again, and we're going to build the mesh. Right, and so just for the sake of knowing what settings I'm using, this is just what I have, and I think this may just be the default. And you're going to go ahead and hit OK, and this is going to run its process. Right, so that was fairly quick. I didn't even pause the recording. So now what we're going to go ahead and do, we're going to switch our view from the dense point cloud to the model, and there's a few different things over here. So this is the model shaded that we have. So far it looks good, and then we're going to go down here. We're going to do model solid. So this is just the actual solid model itself without any other fancy colorings. And then you also have the wireframe, which go ahead and shows you what you're dealing with over here. So as you can see, this bottom, these triangles are pretty large, right? This is low detail. And the reason why is because when we shaded this, as you can see in the dense point cloud, this is empty, right? But in the model, they go ahead and they smooth that over. But we're not going to leave this like this. We'll do something like this to fix this issue to get the other part of that model. But that is that. Now, for the sake of just showing you the last step, not that we have to do this right now, but we're going to go ahead and build the texture, right? And you can really see what the final result is going to end up looking like. So we'll go ahead and run this. And I'll go ahead and bring this back. And it finished creating the texture, and that took about 2 minutes. So building the dense point cloud, is the most time-consuming of all the steps. So when we hit model texture, you can see the difference and really what this brings out. And this, for being captured on just my cell phone, this is like really great results. And what I found is that what you put into this is really what you get. It's not necessarily so much a a high-end camera that will make all the difference in the world. But the amount of photos you take from all the different angles. And so, I've run the same process with only 60 photos, and this end result was not nearly as good. So really, if you want to get a crisper model before running out to buy a really expensive camera, I would first try to take more photos and see if that fixes your issue, because it did fix mine, and I was thoroughly shocked by this. But we're going to progress on forward. So what we're going to go ahead and do now is that we are going to create masks, right? And in order to do so, we're going to come down here to these photos that we have, and we're going to right click. We'll go to masks. We'll go to import masks. Now, initially with this project, I was trying to create masks by hand, individually for each photo. And just like deleting all those excess points, that's a time-consuming process. And of course, thankfully, I found out there's a much faster way to do this, right? A way to automate this, which is why I really liked Metashape for this project. So we're going to do from the model, replacement, and we're going to hit all cameras. And so what this is going to do is that this is going to create masks for each one of these photos. And I'll bring this back when this gets complete. All right, that took about 45 seconds. So if we come down here to our photos and we double click them, it's going to bring you to the photo, and it's going to show you the mask that it just created. Right, so really when you're masking and it creates this automatically, it's going to kind of gray out or black out the rest of this stuff, which means that the program's really going to ignore all this other stuff. It's really going to only focus on what is in the frame, at least by my initial interpretation of this. Granted, I'm not an expert on this program. This is just what I was able to accomplish in a past semester's worth of work with having no exposure to this. But I do know that some people create masks and create models that way if they use a turntable method, but I personally could not get that to work. But you will need masks for this other alignment process that we're about to do. So those masks look good. They may not be precisely perfect, right? There may be a few gaps here or there, especially with more complex models, but for now, that's perfectly fine. So we'll go back to the model, and what we're going to do here is we're going to hit Add Chunk, because we need to get the bottom half of this model in here. We're going to hit Add Photos, go back to the glued arrowhead. Now what I did a separate photo session, right? I just took the model and I picked it up and turned it upside down into the Play-Doh, so that way I can capture the bottom part that was in the Play-Doh. And when I went ahead and I organized my photos by calling this chunk 2, just to make my life easier. Right, and so I imported all of those, right? There's 131 of them, right? You can see them down here, right? You can see that I flipped the model over. I did not change the background at all, right? Or the lighting. I just went ahead and flipped it over. And that's important because Metashape is counting what's in the background over here in order to determine the depth and change that's going on. So it's important that you do take these photos, I suggest, in the same place at the same time, if possible. Because I did have some issues with that. But what we're going to go ahead and do is the same process as before. We're going to align the photos. And I'll bring this back after the alignment. And we're back. So this is the sparse point cloud for the second chunk. And I think that since while we're here, I forgot to mention this earlier, but when you do show cameras, and this doesn't really have to be perfect with the positioning that you can take these cameras, as you can see. But if all your squares and cameras, and this is the initial problem I had with photogrammetry, is that if all the squares and cameras are just like over on one side in one position, what probably ended up happening was that if you were trying to turn the model itself and not move around the model, or you were using a turntable technique and it failed, that is what would end up happening. And it doesn't create the model. It just creates one half of the model that it sees. And the reason why is because it's trying to detect where the object is in space. And so it's using that by also looking at not just the model itself, but the background, which is where masks come in. So I know some people with the turntable method, they use masks in order to ignore the backgrounds. And that can work. I haven't tried it myself. I've had a lot of difficulty with it. Or what some people do is they have a very expensive or very nice setup to where there is no discernible feature other than a white background. or even really a pedestal, and it's just the model itself. So that way Metashape cannot detect any uh, other textures or objects within the frame. And I did get success with that once, but it was far much more of a hassle for me. So I do recommend moving around the model if this is your first time working with this, and then maybe taking that step into the turntable technique. But for right now, we can get rid of those cameras, and we can do the same exact thing that we have done before. So we're going to go over here, and we're just going to select our object, crop the selection, come back over here, and we can go ahead and do that again, right? Just to make sure that we're just keeping that model and the Play-Doh, and we can crop that. Wonderful. And now we're ready to build that dense point cloud. So I'll go again, workflow, build dense point cloud. I put it on medium, calculate point confidence, and then hit OK. And I'll be back when this process also finishes. All right, and we're back with the dense point cloud for the second chunk done. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that. Looks great. Same deal as before. We have a lot of noise right here. So what we are going to go ahead and do is we'll go to Tools, Dense Point Cloud, Filter by Confidence, 0 to 4. We'll even turn on the colors, right? And we will freeform selection and just delete all that. Then we have to bring back our model. So we'll go to Tools again, Dense Point Cloud, Filter by Confidence, at a 255, right? That looks great. So let's go actually head into the selection tool. So let's go ahead and go to the selection tool, and one moment. All right, so now what we can go ahead and do is cut away the bottom of this model, cut that Play-Doh away, and this straight piece right here. We don't need that. And starting with where this Play-Doh is, we'll go ahead and separate that from the rest. Alrighty, so that is good enough. So what we can now do is go to workflow. Now we have this option to align chunks because we have two chunks. We have chunk 1, chunk 2. And we're going to go ahead and align them. A few notes, you have to select both of them. Point-based, high, 150,000. And apply masks, we're going to go ahead and do key points. These are the settings that I'm going to use to align these chunks. All right. There's another method to find key points yourself, right? To find visible pieces, such as a little swirl right here, right? Maybe the glued piece down here, and physically put those points in yourself. I've seen other people do it that way. I'm just going to go ahead and do it this automated way. And we're going to hit OK. And it's going to go ahead and align these for us. The main important part to get this right is that you want to capture, again, both chunks in similar lighting, probably around the same exact time, in the same exact location. If I were to pick up, if I were to do chunk 1 and then later on another day do chunk 2 in a different area at a different time of day, they may not align properly. Or maybe they will align and be totally off course. So those are a few things to be aware of. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and I'll be back when this finishes. All right, that only actually took 15 more seconds from when I paused it. So we have this other option right here to show aligned chunks. And this is going to show us the alignment of both chunk 1 and chunk 2. So they were actually like reversed sides, right? And it actually was able to detect that, turn them around, and put them together. You can manually merge the chunks. It's very time consuming to get it right. And it's much easier, I found, just to do the process from the beginning all the way through and get it right the second time. But this is what it's going to go ahead and look like. Now, it's not merged yet. This is where you can see if there were any issues in the alignment process. And if this was a little off, then I could manually go in and adjust this. But that looks good to me for right now. So what we're going to go ahead and do is workflow. Now we're going to actually merge this. And so when you hit this, chunk 1 and chunk 2, you can merge a few different things here. We're just going to merge the dense point clouds, and we'll build the model up from there. So that was actually fairly quick. We're going to turn off show align chunks. We don't need that anymore. And we're still in chunk 2 over here in our workspace. So we're now going to go to the newly created merged chunk, which has 268 cameras in it. Right. So this is the dense point cloud that we saw, but now we actually have it as a dense point cloud that we can manipulate. So what we're going to go ahead and do now is we're going to do workflow, and we're going to build the mesh. And another point before I do this is that if you do dense point cloud confidence, you can see that we already got rid of all the stragglers. And so if you haven't done so by that step, this is where you could do so. And this really helps out to get a clear image of the model moving forward. So we don't need to do that again. And we can just go ahead and build the model right here. Now we'll see if this only takes a few seconds. And generally, building the model is relatively quicker of all the processes that we're going to go through. So now we're going to view that model. And this is what we are working with. So we do have this kind of Neapolitan look where we have these different colorations. I found that some of these darker colorations down here are as a result of a Play-Doh, because when I've used blue Play-Doh, this tendency of the color over here would scale blue. I haven't really worked out how to fix that yet. Other color changes in here could also be due to lighting. And so having a more balanced lighting setup could help fix this if you're hosting this on a website. But as of right now, I need to try to figure out how to get rid of this Neapolitan look. But for right now, we'll go with it because we are going to print this and it all prints the same. The color doesn't really matter. So when we do so, we can actually take this up to the last step. We're going to build the texture, and then we'll see what that final process looks like. So we'll go ahead and we'll build this texture. It may take a little longer than building the model itself, but it shouldn't take anywhere near as long as building the dense point cloud. We don't really necessarily need the texture for printing. I mean, you may want it to have for when you host this, on a website perhaps, or if you wanted to export the texture and do something else with that texture. But for the purposes that we're going to go ahead and use this, we'll just build it so that way we can see what it looks like. In case you wanted to, you go that route. But for 3D printing, we really just pretty much need the model itself. So I'll go ahead and I'll pause this and bring it back when this process is finished. Alrighty, so we can go ahead and see what this texture ends up looking like. And there it is. And it does help getting rid of the whole Neapolitan look. But it's still there on either side. You can tell that down here, this is where the Play-Doh was. The other side, this was when the tip was stuck on the Play-Doh on that side. So I do think it may have something to do with lighting, but we'll have to just figure that out in the future. But this is really, really good for capturing this on just a smartphone camera, my Galaxy Note 10 Plus. What really helped me get such a clear result was the amount of cameras. We're talking, 130 per chunk, so 268 cameras used in total for this. And I've run the same process with a lot less cameras, and the overall clarity of the results was a lot less. But what we're going to go ahead and do now is we are done with Metashape. So we can go down to File, you can save it, you can export it, you can export as a model, and you're going to choose OBJ as the file format. Now, I already exported this. And so when you already export this as an OBJ format, there's going to be a series of slicers that we're going to use. Right, and so over here, these slicers are going to be dependent on what style of printing you're doing. So for this project, I went ahead on my personal printer, the Anycubic Photon as an SLA resin printer. So I'm going to be using these slicers. Now I'm not going to just use the Photon slicer. So these slicers just take the OBJ file format and allows you to kind of manipulate it to be able to print. Now, I know the printing community has kind of used this trifecta of slicers, from Prusa slicers to Chi-Chi-Box to whatever your normal printer slicer is. So in this case, the Photon Anycubic slicer. I know that recently there is a new slicer, Lychee, that a lot of people have gotten into. I don't really know that much about Lychee, but we do end up using it for this project, but not for the reason other people use it, but because of an obscure problem that I have. So I'll just go ahead and show you the obscure problem that I had with this. So when you upload these files into the slicer, you just go ahead and import the file itself. The scale is really wonky. It's really not anywhere close to the scale that it has. And in these slicers, you can resize it based off of a percentage, which really doesn't help you, but you can rebase it or resize it based off of millimeters. And if only I had a millimeter scale, could I measure the artifact itself and then input the millimeters? But I don't have a millimeter ruler at the time of when I did this. I had it in inches. And none of the other slicers let you measure things in inches or scale things in inches, because why not just use millimeters? I know, it's a weird problem to have, but I only had a ruler that counted in inches, so that's what I went with. And I do know that the scale for the Y factor on this, which is going to be that green arrow, is going to be 2.5. And this was pretty much close enough, to what the real artifact is. And so that was it. That's all I used Lychee Slicer for. Now you can do a lot of the other processes that I'm about to show you, such as supporting within Lychee. I just don't know the process yet. So what I went ahead and did is I went to File, I saved this, right, or exported this as this model, correctly sized. And then I go over to the Prusa Slicer, and I imported this object here, right, the correctly sized portion, not the small sized portion. Now we're going to manipulate this real quick. So we are going to take this and we're going to make sure we're going to put it upright, and then we're really going to tilt it back 45 degrees. And these little markers are here to help you. But so if this is completely upright, right about here, it should be 45 degrees back, right? When printing in resin, you really want to manipulate the artifact or the object to be kind of tilted 45 degrees backwards. You never want to print straight flat because you lose detail, and you don't want to print straight up either because it can be really hard to get off the build plate. And so you really want to do this to conserve resin, but also to make sure that you're supporting the model well and being able to actually get it off the build plate because the suction force can be quite strong. So what we're going to go ahead and do now is I use Prusa Slicer for its supporting features, right? So this is the model itself. It can't print like this because of how stereolithography prints. This print bed is actually going to be upside down. So really, if you want to see what, how this will print, it's going to print something like this. Where this is the top and it's dipping down into this vat of resin and pulling in using UV light to cure it layer by layer. And so really you're going to need support structure coming up from this build plate to the model because sometimes as it builds up layer by layer all the way up to the top, you may lose definition, details, pieces, or tips, or even the whole model if it's not really supported correctly, especially for more complex objects or artifacts. So what we're going to go ahead and do is just support this. Now, Prusa Slicer has a really great auto supporting system. And so you can really play around with this, but what we're going to do is we're going to bring down the support density to about 74%, so that way we don't overkill it. And we're going to auto-generate supports. And so it already detected where to place a lot of the support structure within here. It's not always perfect, but I found that out of all the slicers, I've had a lot of success with very little print failures when using this method. So what we're now going to do, and this is just my personal preference, but I go into manual editing, and I'm going to go ahead and add a few more supports up here, just because I want to be sure that I don't really get droopy pieces anywhere. And I'm going to kind of pick out a few of these ridges or anywhere that I know that I could easily swipe my X-Acto blade when separating the model from the support structure. Right, so I've gone ahead and added a few, so that looks good. We'll hit apply changes. And so now we have a much more thoroughly supported artifact over here. Right, so if you do have a more preferable side to which side holds more detail, you can simply support on the side with less detail. in order to minimize scarring. But what we would then do here is we want to keep the support. So we'll go to File, we'll go to Export, and we're going to export as an STL, including supports. So it takes that support structure with it. Then we're going to come over here in Chitubox. I know we're switching slides, there's a lot, and I went ahead and already uploaded or imported the model, the file where we save the model with the support structure. And what you're going to now do is, this is the build plate. You put in some of the dimensions for whatever printer you have. So this is really great for whichever most SLA printers that you're using. And if you have any other artifacts or objects that you're printing, this is where you would load them in now. And so, I only really have this one artifact in here. When I actually printed the rest of the artifacts, I had a few other artifacts kind of hanging on the build plate. So you can kind of fill it up. You can put multiple copies of this if you want, if you just simply want to duplicate it. Clone current model, there you go. If you wanted to print copies of this, you can just really fill that up here. But we're going to go ahead and delete those for now. We're just going to print this one. And you can really set the settings in the slicer to kind of match whatever printer it is that you're using. And so this gives a good representation for explaining on how something prints in resin. So it's really going to print layer by layer, curing shining UV light layer by layer all the way up the model. And so it's going to slowly build through all of this. And so you can see why you would need some of that support structure moving forward. But we're good with that. So for settings, right, this is where you would enter in all your information. I already pre-filled all this with my printer's information. For resin, this is where you would choose your printing detail, or how the settings you want it to print. Filament or FDM has other settings as well. And there's reasons that you would want to change some of these different settings, such as if you're dealing with a really heavy artifact and you don't want to hollow it out. You can slow the lifting speed. If you had a really dense model and you wanted to hollow it out, which I won't show you here, but this process can also do it in order to conserve resin. And this is where the most important aspect right here is you can change the layer height. So the anycubic photon can go down to 0.02 millimeter layer. So that is, layer by layer building up the model. That will take forever. Probably for this model, probably take about 20 hours to print, which is fine if you have the time. But I will go, when I go ahead and do 0.05, and it still retains a lot of detail, and it really cuts down on the printing time, but it's really up to personal preference. But when you get your settings squared away, right, and it remembers your settings every time, you just hit slice. And it prepares this for printing for you. We're almost done with getting this model printed. And this is another reason why I like Chitubox. Is that, so it tells me my machine, anycubic photon, this is the resin that I'm using, anycubic gray resin. Different resins may require some tweaking with your settings. It's going to tell me the volume that I'm using per this model. So whatever's on the build plate, it'll tell me the overall volume I'm using, the weight, and it will tell me that if the anycubic gray resin is about $40 or $34 or whatever I put in the settings per liter, it will go ahead and it will break down the price automatically for me. And it will tell me that this model will cost me 42 cents of material to print. And it will take me about 7 hours and 2 minutes to get the results that I want for this. All you have to do then is hit save, and it will open this up. And because I told it that my printer is the anycubic photon, it's going to already save this as a .photon file, which is important. The anycubic photon, and I think other printers as well, I'm not entirely sure on that, only accept files that really end in their tagline. At least the anycubic does, or the photon line of printers do. So it's going to save this as a .photon, which is what I want. I'm just going to name this as test. So we'll go ahead and save that. And I will pause the recording, and I'll bring back up the file when I go ahead and I fish that out. So we're back. I went ahead and opened up the file pathway to where I saved this to. So this is now that .photon file. I named it as test. You'll go ahead and open that up, and now this is the last step. This is gonna open it up in the Anycubic slicer. So this is the slicer specific that I need for my specific printer. So whatever printer you have, this final step will vary. All I'm going to do is, this was already, all these settings are imported from Chi2Box because the photon slicer is actually not that great. Out of all the ones that I've showed you, I think it's the worst. But what we're going to go ahead and do now, you're simply going to hit Save As. And then you'll just save this as whatever you want to save it as. So we'll do test, and then you'll do .pws, which is an abbreviation for photon. Sometimes the photon printer is a little finicky. Sometimes it only reads PWS and not .photon. Other times it reads both. It really depends on the day. And then you can go ahead and you can save this to your jump drive and then plug it right into your printer and hit print. And then within about 7 hours and 2 minutes, it will pop out the artifact. So, that is the process of taking a model all the way from its beginning, with starting out with Metashape and how you take those photos, all the way over unto the end. I'll go ahead and I'll show you some photos of the printing process in order to help get a better idea of all of that. So here are some photo comparisons that I took in my photo box real quick of the printed artifact after I printed it and the actual artifact over on the right-hand side. So the scale's a little off, right? I mean, it's fixable. You can go back in and resize it and maybe measure it in millimeters this time. But you can see that all the ridges along the side are all preserved, right? These ridges in the center, right? A lot of detail that went into it. Now, is it an exact one-to-one creation? No. But it is fairly close. Much better, I can attest, than FDM. And so you can even see the crack where this artifact was cut, was broken in half and then glued back. You can see that in there as well. And then if you wanted to put primer or acrylic paint on this to try to replicate its look, maybe for educational purposes, that could also work. The other side of the model, real quick, just to show that off as well. You can see a lot more of these ridges. Really what you see down here, see these imperfections. These are actually just stray, small slices that I made with an X-Acto knife into the bottom. This is where a lot of that support structure was. Now, thankfully, with the process that I've used, it didn't really tear chunks out. It just created these tiny little cuts. I can tell you, though, that the moment you put even the smallest layer of acrylic paint over this in order to replicate the look over here, you don't see these really, really, really tiny cuts at all. And so overall, this did produce fantastic results for just a cell phone. And so once again, just to close things out, my name is Trevor Colinari. And this was the process that I've worked on how to create these artifacts. So the goal for this video is hopefully that this did help you out if you are trying to go through a similar process with learning photogrammetry or 3D printing. So if you have any things that I may have missed in the initial video, you can go ahead and put that in the comments, and I can check it out. Perhaps maybe how to fix the Neapolitan look. But I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it helps, and I hope you have a great day.